Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Welcome, everyone, to our briefing today on democracy versus illiberal democracy win in Eastern Europe. And maybe it's not such a binary question. We shall find out. We're really fortunate today to have two excellent speakers and a fantastic moderator, and I will introduce them momentarily. Just very briefly before we begin, for those who are joining us for the first time, on Network 2020, we're an inclusive international community. We're based out of New York, but we really have members from all over the world. And we're really trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We do this through a number of different programs, including this virtual briefing series. And we're also really trying to highlight and drive some innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges, as well as elevate the overall conversation around foreign policy. So with that, I'd love to introduce our speakers today. Really quickly, this is the second in our State of Democracy series. Apologies, we had another slide that I forgot about. And we're really trying to do this series to take a look at the state of democracy worldwide, just because there is a lot that's in flux. And so we're trying to add to the conversation in the way that we can, which is by looking at some different angles around the state of democracy. And so this briefing, I think, is a really critical one as well, where we're looking at the state of democratic backsliding. And we will be emailing all of you as we confirm future dates over the next few months. So we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Timothy Garton Ash. He is a giant in the field of European studies and has been following the events that have transformed Europe over the past few decades, including from both sides of the Berlin Wall before its fall. He charted the transformation of Central Europe through the 1980s and is intimately familiar with the trajectory of democracy in Eastern and Central Europe. And one of his many books, and he's written, I think, about 10, is The Magic Lantern, The Revolution of '89. And that has a new edition, which includes a long new chapter looking at developments over the last 30 years and asking precisely why things went wrong. So he is a perfect person to have here with us today. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by Andras Petho. And like Professor Garton Ash, Andras is a journalist who has who has likewise witnessed the transformation of societies and sectors. He was the senior editor for leading Hungarian news site Origo, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, before it was transformed into a government propaganda outlet. He has received numerous fellowships and awards for his reporting and is currently the co-founder and editor of Direkt36. And last but not least, we are joined by Network 2020's own Joanna Waszczowski, who has been a charter member of Network 2020. She's participated in some of our research programs and helped author a report, Poland Beyond Solidarity, back in 2004. She has a lot of international experience on boards and in government as a policy advisor, and has her PhD from Oxford, among other credentials. So we're very fortunate to have Joanna leading this conversation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joanna, with deep thanks to all of you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Today's discussion will focus on the transformation of Poland and Hungary from being viewed essentially as the poster children of democracy after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe to highly visible examples of illiberal democracy. According to Freedom House's Nations in Transit 2021, Poland and Hungary stand out for their unparalleled democratic deterioration over the past decade. How did this change happen in both countries, and what does it portend for the future? What can the United States and the European Union do to influence events in Poland and Hungary? And what are Russian interests or involvements in the region? These are all critical questions which I look forward to discussing with our panelists this afternoon. So my first question, which is a two-part question, is for Professor Garton Ash. Could you provide, being an eyewitness to the events, could you provide a brief history of the revolutions of 1989, specifically Poland and Hungary? In addition, the first decade or so after 1989 appeared to go relatively well in those countries. Why did things begin to change?
Sure, with pleasure. Well, let me say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you, with an old Antonian, and also with Andras Petho, whose work on Direkt36 I greatly admire. I first went to Hungary and Poland in 1979, when it seemed completely inconceivable that the Berlin Wall would come down and these countries would become part of the West. Poland and Hungary were then the icebreakers through the 1980s to 1989, the Solidarity Movement Board in Poland in August 1980, the reform process in Hungary, the emergence of a democratic opposition. And in 1989 too, they were the path breakers. The first semi-free election in the Soviet bloc, 4th of June 1989, by the way, the day of the Tiananmen massacre in Beijing, in Poland, which paves the way for a non-communist government. And in Hungary, the great moment, which I was privileged and happy to witness and describe in the book, The Magic Lantern, the ceremonial reburial of Imre Nagy, the reform communist leader of the 1956 revolution, where the outstanding speaker was a young, fiery, and we thought liberal young man called Viktor Orban, who also, I'm afraid to say, had been our student at Oxford. And having pioneered the transition, then through the 1990s, they were also in the lead. The first shock therapy was in Poland. Hungary was the first post-communist state to apply for membership of the European Union in 1994. And you said, Joanna, things went relatively well. I would say they went spectacularly well. You know, in '89, we had no idea whether you could turn a centrally planned command economy and a communist system back into some version of a pluralist liberal democracy. And actually, if one looked at it in 2004, both countries are now members of NATO, both countries are now members of the EU. They look like consolidated democracies. I would have said things have gone much better than we expected. But as you indicate, discontents were building up in these societies, which continued to build up through the 2000s under more or less liberal governments. And what I would say on that, Joanna, is that it's a mix of the generic discontents that gave you in the US Donald Trump and us Boris Johnson and the French Marine Le Pen, and specific post-communist discontents, which have to do, for example, with a sense of historical injustice about the transition, because actually it was many of the post-communists, the former members of the apparatus, who got rich from the transition. And there were a bunch of other reasons, the generic and the specific. But it's not until 2010, when Viktor Orban comes to power for the second time in Hungary, that you really get the process of a populist government systematically setting about dismantling liberal democracy while the country remains a member of the European Union. And with that, perhaps over to Andras to talk about what happened in Hungary.
Yes, exactly. Andras, if you can say, you know, what did happen in Hungary? What measures did Orban carry out? And what lessons do you think he learned from his first failed government?
First of all, let me say that I'm also really grateful. I mean, thank you for having me here, and it's an honor to be in the to do this together with Professor Garton Ash. It's even a little bit intimidating, I have to admit, but I will try to do my best. So yeah, I think in order to understand Orban and what Orban has been doing in the last 10 years, we have to go back a little bit in time. So he was already in power between 1998 and 2002, and he lost at the election in 2002, and it was kind of a surprise. Definitely, it was a shock for his party and for his supporters. He lost against most polls showed that he would win. So this came as a shock for him, and I think he talked about this, but certainly people close to him have talked about this in later, that one of the lessons that he learned or he drew from that experience was that maybe he was in government, maybe he was leading the government, but he was not leading the country, he was not ruling the country, he was not really in charge. I think he felt that the old elite, the socialist regime, was still in power, and they controlled the media, the economy, the judiciary, the whole cultural sphere, the education, everything. That was his. Whether this is true or not, that's a really long discussion. I can certainly say that I studied journalism in the 90s. That's when I started to started to work as a journalist, and I had the impression that yes, there was a left-wing liberal dominance in that sphere. But so Orban apparently he decided that if he ever gets back to power again, he has to build a new another system, another machine. And of course, he could have chosen to build a system that is more open, that is more fair, but he chose to build a system, a machine that is even better, even more powerful than the one that the socialists, the old rulers had. And so basically, the moment he came back to power in 2010, he started doing this. And somewhat unfortunately for us journalists, the first target was, the first steps that they took was impacted the media. The very first legislations that they introduced in parliament when they won, and actually they won by a landslide, they won a supermajority in the parliament in 2010, and that was, to be fair, I think it was partly, or a big reason for that was the incompetence and the corruption of the previous liberal left-wing governments, and of course the financial crisis and everything. There were many factors. So that then very systematically he started to dismantle the existing system and build a new one. And then they went after the media. They started with the public media. In Hungary, like in most of Europe, we have something like a public media that is supposed to be impartial, independent, that is financed in some ways by the taxpayers or by the state, and they took that under control. Then they went after some of the private media companies like Origo that Courtney mentioned in the introduction, where I worked at the time. They put these companies under pressure and they took them over, and they did. It was not only the media. They restricted the powers of the Constitutional Court. They appointed new leaders in the judiciary. And this hasn't stopped. This has expanded. Like a few years ago, I had a conversation with someone who is working for a senior official in the governing party, and then this source told me that that Orban realized that if he really wants to be in charge, it's not enough to control the parliament, the legislation. It's not enough to control the public discourse, the media. He has to control the economy. And this is where you find more similarities with Russia, with Putin's Russia. That he, what Putin did was that he took the natural resources industry under control, and that's how he established his power. What Orban has been doing is that he took some of these key sectors, the media, banking, the energy sector, the agriculture under control. And of course, he doesn't do this personally. He has his friends, his allies in business who are doing this for him. So yeah, that's where we are more or less, like in a nutshell.
Yeah, and most recently, I think there was the controversial issue of creating foundations that will then govern universities and cultural institutions, correct?
Yes, absolutely. This is we don't really know. I mean, why they are doing this. I mean, one interpretation is that basically they want to make sure that if they lose at the next elections, which is coming up next year, and now that we have a more or less unified opposition, actually the opposition has a chance to win. And like they did in 2019, they took they won in some of the bigger cities at the municipal elections. So this is a way to cement the power that they have now. So they set up these foundations, and these foundations are controlled by pro-government people. These foundations have really massive wealth, assets, whole universities, properties. They own some of the shares. I mean, big ownership in some of the largest Hungarian corporations. So, and yes, this is a. I mean, what is kind of ironic is that basically, a lot of people say that this is what the socialists did at the regime change in 89 and 90, when they saw that, okay, we are going to lose the political power, but at least we can have the economic power. And they moved some of those assets that the state party had before the regime change, and they moved it into private hands. And basically this is what is happening now, or something that is very similar to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. So my question now is for Professor Garton Ash. How has Poland followed the Hungarian example? Is Jarosław Kaczynski essentially the leader of Poland, unofficially, but essentially? He appears to be a disciple of Orban. And where is Poland located on this authoritarian highway, so to speak?
Well, let me quickly just say a couple of words about Hungary. First of all, we were not wrong in one thing about Viktor Orban. We saw in him a very talented politician, and that he certainly is. One of the 2 or 3 most effective politicians in Europe. It's amazing how the leader of a small country has become so influential in Europe. Number 2, just to emphasize the point Andras made, which is he had a constitutional majority in 2010. So he was able to change the constitution. The Law and Justice Party in Poland has never had that. That's a significant difference. Number 3, it's really worth emphasizing, particularly for the American members of the audience, that what happened in the 90s and 2000s was not classic nation state building. It was what I call member state building. So you were building your country, your institutions, ready to be a member state of the European Union, i.e. a model liberal democracy. So what Orban has done brilliantly is to keep the facade of a plural liberal democracy, all those wonderful institutions that fulfill all the EU criteria, but demolish them from behind. It's like a sort of Potemkin village, but Potemkin city. So that, for example, media, which Andras was talking about, it's not censorship or anything crude like that. It's just that you've had your mates, your friendly oligarchs, take over all the genuinely independent media. So those are important elements of the Orban model. And now, Joanna, to your question. If you read Polish right-wing magazines, they make no bones about it. We want to do Orbanization à la Polonaise. We want to follow the Hungarian model. They say that explicitly, Budapest and Warsaw. And the motivation for Kaczynski, I mean, Orban fundamentally is interested in wealth and power, right? There may be some element of genuine conservative nationalist Christian ideology, but it's mainly wealth and power. Kaczynski is perhaps more ideological, but like Orban, he was so frustrated because he too had been in government in 2005 to 7. And then, shockingly, the voters had kicked him out. How dare they? This is not what democracy means. And so he had this term impossibilism, impossibilism, the impossibility of really changing your country when you only have the government and the presidency. So come 2015, when the Law and Justice Party got both a majority in parliament and the presidency for a man called Andrzej Duda, they started down the path of urbanization, but they are much less far down that path because the forces of opposition in Poland are much stronger. Civil society is very strong, major opposition parties, major independent media. I hope we'll come to that because one of the key ones is American owned. Major other forces at play. So they have got much less far down the world. What they have achieved is the almost complete Gleichschaltung of the courts. Some independent judges are still holding out, but basically they've taken control of the courts, which, by the way, undermines the whole legal order of the European Union. They've got control, of course, of the security services, of the civil service, so-called, the administration. They've pumped masses of money into state media, but they were nowhere as far down the road. I would actually say Hungary is no longer a democracy. I would call it a competitive authoritarian system. Now, you may say, but Andras has just said the opposition can win the next election. But you know, Milosevic was toppled after an election. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine was after an election. Elections are moments of danger, even for competitive authoritarian regimes. Poland, I think, Joanna, is genuinely an illiberal democracy. That is to say, a liberal democracy in a state of advanced decay, but still absolutely reversible with a little help from their friends.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I guess one of my last questions before we turn over to our participants is, where do Poland and Hungary go from here? If you can look in the crystal ball and try to figure out, and what can the United States and the EU do to influence the Polish-Hungarian governments, if anything? Whoever would like to take that first.
Andras, go ahead.
Yeah, well, you know, as they say in journalism, you know, prediction is the lowest form of journalism. Journalists still do that all the time, so I try to, you know, stay away from that. But I can add a couple of thoughts. Well, yeah. Whatever happens in next year's elections, you know, it's not going to, Orban is not going to disappear, and Orbanism is not going to disappear. Just like, you know, Trumpism hasn't disappeared in the U.S. I think that he's shown time and time again that he's the kind of politician who can think strategically. You know, just these moves that we've discussed about the foundations, you know, that shows that he's thinking about the long term, and he has the advantage of having a party behind him that is 100% loyal to him. He controls that party and the machine completely. You know, on the other side, you know, the opposition, as I said, more or less unified, but it's still, you know, we are talking about like 5 or 6 parties, or I don't even know how many exactly, and you know, they just still they have to figure out who the candidate will be in the next year's elections. So, and as far as the EU and the US are concerned, I think we will be much smarter after, like, maybe mid-fall, after the German elections. I mean, that will tell us a lot. Germany is the dominant power in the European Union, and actually it was to a lot of extent, it was Germany that, and the presence of the German industry in Hungary, specifically the automotive industry, that allowed this to happen. Orban had huge leverage through the car industry in the EU. So, and the EU didn't really have a lot of leverage over Orban. They made, in hindsight, it was totally understandable at the time, but in hindsight, that was a huge mistake when Orban came to power in 2010, and his first trip was to Brussels. He went to meet the head of the European Commission. And basically, he had one request. He wanted more freedom, more room for fixing the budget, the finances of Hungary after the financial crisis. And of course, this was the time when we already had the Greek crisis and everything. So, they just didn't let him anything. They had to follow the austerity that was dictated by Brussels and by Germany. And then Orban basically said, okay, so I'm going to do it my way. And he did it his way. And there was no leverage over him. So, and the US, Orban likes to say that, the US doesn't really matter. They have values, but we have values too. This is a quote from a piece of one of my colleagues. He's watching what Berlin is doing and what Moscow is doing, and now what China is doing. Yeah, so, but I think I already talked too much about this, even though I said that I wouldn't go into predictions. Sorry.
That's all right. Professor?
So the good news in Poland is that the governing party/parties, because it's formally speaking a coalition, is falling apart. The bad news is that the opposition is even more disunited. And that's disastrous, because if you had a more united opposition in Poland, they would be in a very strong position. The front line of the struggle to defend democracy in Poland over the next year is the defense of the independent media, because that's absolutely crucial, and that's what they're going after. Those media, the key media, are often partly or wholly foreign-owned. The major newspaper group Agora, which owns Gazeta Wyborcza, the major news website onet.pl, but above all, as in all our countries, internet, schminternet, television is still absolutely crucial for politics. Fox News was more important than Facebook in the US. And the big independent television station, TVN, is owned by the Discovery Channel in the US. So if you ask what the US can do, the first thing is make sure Discovery doesn't sell TVN, because what Peace, Law and Justice would like to do is to do exactly what Orban did. You make them an offer they can't refuse. You make them an offer well over the realistic market price, because this is done by, say, a public company or state-owned enterprise, because you're going to be rewarded for that by other parts of the state. And so for commercial reasons, looking at shareholder value, Discovery might feel impelled to say, okay, this is an amazing offer, we'll take it. But it's crucial that they don't. Beyond that, the US, let's be clear, is much less influential relatively than it was in the 1990s, when it was absolutely crucial in the times of Clinton and Madeleine Albright and NATO enlargement. And let's face it, the US has one or two other problems on its plate and other priorities, but the fact that it's Biden emphasizing the importance of democracy worldwide, rather than Donald Trump, who, let me remind you, received both Andrzej Duda and Viktor Orban in the White House, is itself very significant, because Poland in particular looked to the US as a great supporter. But absolutely crucial is the EU. It is an absolutely scandalous fact that in what is supposed to be a democratic community of democracies, you have a full member state that is not a democracy. So Britain, which is a liberal democracy, has left, but Hungary, which is not a liberal democracy, is still a member. And as Andras rightly said, frankly speaking, the EU has done almost sweet Fanny Adams, almost nothing to halt the erosion of democracy. On the contrary, the billions of euros coming from EU funds to these governments, and they're distributed by the national governments, are a huge asset for the populist nationalist governments. And now they will be getting billions more from the COVID recovery funds. The EU has totally failed to link what I call the Europe of money and the Europe of values. There is no effective operational linkage between what you do about your courts and your independent media and your democracy and whether or not you get those billions of euros. And last point before going into the discussion, Andras is so right. Germany is the central power of Europe. And Germany is particularly powerful in East Central Europe. Andras mentioned the car industry. I heard a Polish economist the other day say, you know, the Polish economy is part of the German economy. I mean, there really is an economic Mitteleuropa. And therefore, Germany potentially has enormous leverage in the region. And they have not used it under Angela Merkel. They absolutely have not. The classic example was that Orban's party, Fidesz, remained until the day before yesterday a member of the European People's Party, which is the key center-right political grouping in the European Parliament and in the EU. And that was because of Germany. If the Christian Democrats in Germany had gone the other way, Fidesz would have been kicked out long ago. So a really key question, if we look to the future, frankly, more important than US policy, is what the new German government, which will be elected in September, will do. If the German Greens are a major part of that coalition government, which looks likely at the moment, then I have some hope that you'll get more leverage from Germany on issues of rule of law, human rights, and democracy. So let's hope.
Yes, thank you. So we'll turn over now to our participants' questions. And first question following on about the EU is from Arletta Laurent. She was former EU Deputy Chief of Mission at the United Nations. And she says, when one sees the difficulty of East Germany's integration since reunification, how could one expect countries which went from fascism to communism to integrate almost overnight into democratic liberal systems of the EU? Should, in retrospect, have the EU proposed an EFTA solution to help a transition without these countries being at the table?
Absolutely not. I think that's a West European myth, if not, if I may say so, prejudice. Listen, Spain was a fascist country in 1975. Greece was run by a junta of colonels. Portugal was run by a Catholic reactionary dictatorship. If they can adapt and transform their societies to be part of a European Union in the space of 30 years, why should not Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, Central European countries with great traditions of their own? I think that's a canard. I don't think the mistake was to bring them in after 15 years after 1989. I think the mistake was that during the accession process, for those first 15 years, you had fantastically powerful conditionality, right? You had to meet a whole set of standards, for example, on minority rights or media pluralism, in order to become a member of the EU. But once you became a member, you can do pretty much whatever you like. You can get away with blue murder, colloquially speaking. So that, I think, was a fundamental mistake. Not that it was a premature accession, but that the conditionality disappeared at the moment of accession.
All right, thank you. And then here's a question for Andras. What do you see as the possible symbolism of Shanghai's Fudan University establishing a campus in Budapest? The Chinese claim that they are not exporting their model. Is there a relation with the fate of the CEU, Central European University? And this is from Thomas Gold from Cal Berkeley.
I'm very, very happy to talk about this, and I'm really proud of this because I mean, not that the Chinese university is coming to Hungary, but because the story was broken by Direkt36 by my colleague Szabolcs Panyi. He was the one who obtained some confidential government documents that showed that basically the government is giving or wants to give money to the Chinese to build this university in Budapest, and basically the government is willing to give all kinds of resources to invite this university to Budapest. And it's yeah, there is a certainly, you know, it's very you know, the contrast is couldn't be more obvious. Like, you know, a couple of years ago another a great university, very prestigious university, the Central European University, was kicked out of Budapest. It was a university that was an American, US accredited and registered university that was based in Budapest and has been there for more than 20 years. And it was founded by George Soros, the Hungarian-born American billionaire, who has been the target of a very, very massive campaign, disinformation campaign in recent years. So as part of that campaign, the university was also targeted, and then it was kicked out of Budapest, and now they are based in Vienna. And so a lot of people have pointed out that the irony, the brutal irony of this, that and especially that it's Orban who rose to fame, whose whole political career started on the platform of anti-communism. And even like 10, 12 years ago, his senior party officials from his party, they were protesting against you know, the treatment of Tibet, and so it's such it's such a, you know, about face when it comes to the values and that what they were doing. Regarding the university itself, Fudan, I mean, as far as we know, it's a great university. I mean, academically, I think their ranking is global ranking is pretty good. But it's also known that it's part of the communist regime. It has official ties to the Communist Party, and even if it's you know, it's probably unlikely that you know, they will come to Budapest to promote communism or even the Chinese form of you know, state capitalism. It's I think we have to view this in the context of this huge power struggle between, you know, the global powers, the US and China, and, you know, this the alliances that we are part of. So I think in that context, it's a huge development.
Oh, thank you.
Hungary is opening the doors to this university.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. The next question deals with contagion, contagion of the Polish-Hungarian examples to other countries in the region. It's from Miladin Bogetic. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Do you see a risk that Slovakia or the Czech Republic could go down the same path? And that's a question for either one of you.
Yeah, let me take that one. I mean, first of all, just to add to what Andras said, I mean, it is an absolute scandal that the CEU, the best university in the region was simply kicked out. And two people responsible for that are Donald Trump, because the US didn't intervene decisively to protect an American university, and Angela Merkel, who didn't think it was worth her while to make it a big deal. So it's a shocking fact. And of course, Orban has explicitly said in a famous speech in 2014 that modernity now isn't necessarily on the side of the West. He said maybe China or Russia are showing us models of a liberal modernity. On the contagion question, I don't think contagion is quite the right way to put it, because you basically have some of the same trends which are apparent, just slightly less strongly. The key cases would be Slovenia under Janša, who's an ally of Orban, and to a lesser extent, the Czech Republic under Andrej Babiš, who's an oligarch turned prime minister. They are, as it were, sort of softer versions of what's happening in Hungary and Poland. But on the other hand, Slovakia is to some extent going the other way. Slovakia, you have the election of Zuzana Čaputová, who is a rather brave, very liberal female, significantly in a strongly Catholic conservative country, lawyer and activist. So it's not a clear picture. I would say that the direction of travel depends to a significant degree on what happens in Poland over the next 3 to 4 years. Which way does Poland go? Because it is, after all, the biggest country in East Central Europe, but also what happens in France, what happens in the Netherlands, what happens in the rest of Europe. If there's a clear European trend back in a more liberal direction, then I think particularly smaller countries in East Central Europe will be less inclined to go the Orban route.
Mm-hmm. All right. There's an interesting question from Anna Dwyer. I mean, they're all interesting questions, but this is a little more unusual. Both countries are Catholic. What role has the church played in determining where they find themselves? And whoever would like to go first with that.
Well, shall I don't think both countries are Catholic, so let me take Poland, which really is, and then Andras can talk about Protestantism and the churches in Hungary. Listen, I mean, the church is obviously a hugely important actor throughout modern Polish history, and up till recently was a very significant ally of the Law and Justice Party, and indeed priests would encourage their congregations to go vote from the pulpit. And we've seen very little left of the Church of John Paul II, which, contrary to what some of your colleagues may think, was not a simply reactionary church. In politics, it was in favor of universal human rights. In the Polish context, it often took relatively liberal, certainly politically, positions. But the church has been deeply compromised by pedophile scandals, major pedophile scandals, really horrifying pedophile scandals, and look at the impact of those in Ireland. B, capitalism had done what communism has not, half emptied the churches. There's a clear trend of secularization. And C, the church is beginning to wake up to the fact that it may have got too close to the Law and Justice Party for a lot of its, so to speak, middle class, small c conservative, but pro-European congregations. So there's some extent I see the church beginning to withdraw a little bit from the political arena. And that, if that trend continues, is going to be quite damaging to the Law and Justice Party, which of course claims its legitimacy from both the national and the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, I'm really not an expert on the church and the religion. I don't think that Hungary has never been as as Catholic as Poland. The Catholic Church hasn't been as powerful in Hungary as there, you know. And Orban himself, well, I need to search my memory, but I'm pretty sure that when he got married, they got married with his wife, then the wedding was administered by not a Catholic a priest, but a pastor from a different church. So I don't think that Orban is, you know, very close to the, at least, you know, religiously very close to the Catholic Church. And my impression has always been that in Hungary, while the Christian churches have always been clearly supporting the right-wing parties, the conservative parties, but they were more like following. They were not really leading the public opinion on that.
Could I just add to that? Nonetheless, Orban talks a lot about Christianity now. He talks a lot about Christian values. And he says, we are more European than you. You're the decadent, multicultural, LGBTQ, socially liberal, bicycle riding vegetarian Europe. We are the good, strong, traditional, national Christian Europe. We are the anti-morale Christianitas, the bulwark of Christianity against these Muslim immigrants and so forth. So while I don't think it's very important to him at heart, who knows, and while I don't think the churches are very important, I think the rhetoric of defending Christian Europe is quite important.
Okay, and then there's a question about what role has Russia played in the authoritarianism of Poland and Hungary, if any?
Well, this is a really interesting one, because you see the value system that Orban represents is in many ways quite comparable to that of Vladimir Putin, and some of his ways of exercising power too. But it's a huge difference between the Hungarian and the Polish right, because as Andras will tell you, Orban is quite happy meeting with Putin and making deals with Putin, also business deals, whereas because of Polish history, and in particular because the brother of Jarosław Kaczynski, Lech Kaczynski, a former president of Poland, died in a plane crash near Katyn in Russia, which the Polish right attributes to Russian conspiracy. They continue to take a very anti-Russian position. So that when we see the emergence of what looks like a rather concerning far-right populist alliance between Orban, Kaczynski, and Matteo Salvini, the key populist leader in Italy, the issue of relations with Russia is a real bone of contention between them. Fortunately, in a sense, because otherwise it could be a formidable alliance.
As Orban has changed so much throughout his career. Like you know, it wasn't a long time ago, 2008, when when Russia attacked the Georgian War took place. Then, you know, Orban was one of the most vocal critic of that aggression in the EU. But then when he came to power, you know, obviously, you know, at the time that made sense politically. You know, he needed the Americans' support. He was courting the West. But then after 2010, of course, Putin has also changed. And we remember how the relationship between the U.S. and Russia has turned much more, you know, antagonistic. And so in the last 10 years, while I don't think you can call them allies or friends, but certainly a special relationship has been established between the two of them. And now, and this is what our reporting shows when we look at specific cases, specific stories, our reporting shows that when Orban had to choose between the Western alliance, between the interests of the US, for example, or the Russian interests, he went with the Russians. And these are like, sometimes very concrete cases, like when, again, this was a story that one of my colleagues reported when in Hungary, a US operation, as part of a US operation, 2 Russian arms dealers were arrested. It's a very complex case. I'm not going to go into the details, but the Americans wanted these 2 Russian arms dealers to extradite it, to be extradited to the US, but then the Russians wanted them too, and the Hungarians gave them back to the Russians. And that caused a huge discontent in the US, and that's something that that showed that this relationship, however you want to call it, it's a friendship, alliance, partnership, whatever, but it's definitely a strong one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. What lessons can other countries around the world who face populist movements learn from the Polish and Hungarian examples?
Andras, do you want to have a go at that? And then I'll
Yeah,
follow.
Yes, I can. Yeah, yes. Well, yeah, let me share. I just finished this morning. I started reading Robert Caro's gigantic Lyndon Johnson biography, and I just finished the 2nd volume. And it's a wonderful book, and it's just amazing on every level. And then the 2nd book is about basically how Lyndon Johnson stole the 1948 Senate election in Texas. And he stole it by, falsifying records, or his allies did it, stuffing ballot boxes, but also through disinformation campaigns, through spending a lot of money, through abusing the judicial system, everything. It's reported very deeply in the book, of course. But I think it's, that story, that book showed me that, this whole system that we have, democracies, they are very, very fragile, If someone comes who is ruthless enough, who has the necessary resources, and, those can very easily exploit and abuse these systems. I know it's not an upbeat message. It's not very, optimistic. But Hungarians are famously pessimistic people, so I have to tell you that. But I think there is on the other hand, that also shows us that you have to fight for this. You have to value what you have, and you have to watch for the signs. When you see that this system is being eroded, or when it is being exploited, because it can happen anywhere. It can even happen in the United States. It can happen basically any country. What we have, Professor, Garton Ash will correct me, but these are relatively new structures, in the history of mankind. What we have here.
So can I sort of pick up on that, which is I'm just writing a history of contemporary Europe, and the thing one has constantly emphasized is the fragility of what we've achieved. That people do tend to take it for granted that we have however many democracies in Europe, and you can move from one end to the continent freely and so on. And when you look at it, it is so fragile. So I so much agree with that. I think there is maybe 3 lessons. One, for the rest of the EU, this has to become a top priority. It really does. It's had much too low a priority because if one or two member states cease to be a democracy, it puts in question the entire functioning of the European Union. Just think about it. You have decisions that are being made for 27 member states in what's called the Council of Ministers or the European Council in Brussels. So the decisions that actually change lives in France or Italy or Spain. But one of the people sitting at that table is not actually a properly democratically elected leader. That undermines the whole system. So there's a big lesson for the rest of the EU. Secondly, the obvious point, culture is as important as economics. It's a lesson of Donald Trump, it's a lesson of Brexit, and it's a lesson of Poland and Hungary. We believed far too much in the primacy of economics. And the third one, I would say, not just in relation to Poland and Hungary, is free speech remains absolutely critical to the defense of democracy. And for effective free speech, you need not just independent media, but also a shared public sphere where people actually meet and get the same set of facts and can actually exchange their opinions. That has almost totally disappeared in Poland, but American friends, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me quite seriously threatened in the United States as well.
Yes, well, thank you. And the final question I would like to pose is, I lived in Poland in the 90s and I witnessed the transition happening of rewriting a constitution and all sorts of issues and events. And I always have hope based on what I've seen. So is there anything that you are optimistic about in these countries that could have an impact for the future? I'd like to end on some positive note.
Well, why don't we start with the Hungarian pessimist and then I'll be the Polish optimist.
It's a personal, maybe it's a personal story or a personal example that I'm old enough to remember socialism. I'm old enough to remember, like, how it was when the media was dominated by the party government, and when my parents couldn't tell me things because I understood later, like, why they didn't tell me things, or why they were silent over certain topics. And I was relatively young. I mean, I was 12 years old when the regime change took place, but I remember that was a regime change for a reason, because people were not happy with that system. So I think that it's this cannot continue like this forever. It's also that I also understand that it's a different kind of regime that we have now, and I won't go into, because I'm not an academic, so I'm really bad with definitions but the one thing that worries me and makes me concerned about the developments in the last 10 years is the fear that I can feel that people are afraid again to express themselves. Like when especially when we go outside Budapest and we want to do, we, as my investigative reporting center, we do live events. Well, of course, now everything is online, but that was really frustrating when, simply just booking a venue was impossible in some smaller cities, because once they realized who we were, they canceled, and they said it's not available anytime, no, in the future. So, but again, so that's really concerning. But I also think that, you know, people don't want to live like that. Who wants to live like that? Nobody wants to live like that. So that gives me some kind of hope.
So I think that intellectual pessimism is actually a good thing. It's a good thing to expect the worst and then work for the best. You know, if you tell yourself the water's going to be really cold, then when you dive in, it doesn't feel quite so cold. I mean, I think what is worrying is the global context as well. The fact that there is this alternative modernity in China, which is in the ascendant and which is quite attractive to a lot of people elsewhere in the world, so that, as it were, the global trends are nothing like as favorable as they were in the 1990s. But here's the optimism for you, Joanna. Nationalist populism in Poland is working a little bit like a traditional vaccination. People have had an injection of the virus, and so the immune system is really starting to kick in quite strongly. And you can see that on the streets of Poland, where 15 years ago, people didn't care much about the constitution or independent courts or European law or any of these things. They were all rather abstract, and they were sort of stuff you had to do in order to get into the EU and be part of the West and be able to go and, you know, work and live in the West and so on. But people hadn't really made them their own. Now, because they're under attack, they are really making them their own. And people walk around with T-shirts saying Konstytucja, Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
You may have seen at the funeral of George H.W. Bush. I think American TV audiences couldn't work out exactly what Lech Wałęsa was doing with this T-shirt under his suit jacket at the funeral, but it said Konstytucja. He was standing up for the Constitution. People are really standing up for the independent courts. And the other day I heard a demonstration in Krakow where people were actually chanting separation of powers, separation of powers. Where else in the world would you have a crowd chanting separation of powers? So that what's happening is a kind of generation of the sort of liberal constitutional immune system, and people are actually standing up for liberal democracy. And that does make me very cautiously optimistic.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you both so very much for a fascinating discussion. We could go on. There were still lots of questions, but I think you did great justice to the conversation today, and to give people, a thoughtful insight into what is happening in the region. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Courtney.
Yes, just to echo Joanna, thank you both. That was fascinating. I learned so much. Joanna, thank you for doing an excellent job moderating. Thank you everyone for the fantastic questions. It was, we will take the cautious optimism, although I was worried that we weren't going to get there. Just a quick note, our next event is on Tuesday, May 18th at noon Eastern, and that's looking at the Iranian election. So we have three excellent experts who will be talking to us about that. So please do RSVP on our website. You can, I think Brian just put a link in the chat, or you can use the QR code. And again, my constant plea as a nonprofit, we are really struggling to try to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world. And we really want to do that. So if you can donate, we encourage you to. It means a lot to us, big or small. So thank you very much. And again, thank you, Professor Garton Ash. Thank you, Andras. This was a really fantastic conversation. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.